SNC Lavalin, Canada's latest scandal broken down, and updates on the terrible Boeing situation. I'm Marco Perri. Welcome to the Perri Platform. I'll start today off with a funny story. It's funny for you, but sad for me. This entire episode I already previously recorded, but due to some technical difficulties, I unfortunately lost all my files. So here we go, take two. So, the Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Trudeau, is royally screwed. Now, why do I say that? Well, it's because he is enveloped in a national crisis involving SNC Lavalin. So a little bit of background information for those of you who are unaware. SNC is a global engineering firm who employs a bunch of people worldwide. Even within Quebec alone, there's over 3,000 employees. And everything was going peachy for them until they started getting investigated for bribery claims. Turns out they were bribing Libyan officials for contracts to the tune of over $47 million. And get this, there's even rumors going around that they may have also been bribing Canadian officials. So, as a result, our former Attorney General, Jody Wilson-Raybould, started an investigation into them with plans to prosecute them publicly in the court of law. And, next thing you know, Mr. Justin Trudeau comes thumping down the stairs and has some input to say, but it might not be what you expect. Actually, what he does is he tells Miss Raybould that, maybe you should ease up on SNC a little bit. Maybe you should settle outside of court, get them to pay a small fine, and we can all go on our merry way. But wait a second, pause. The Attorney General has a suspicion here. She wants to take them to court because she does think something's wrong. Bribery is against the law, and we have to uphold that because we live in a lawful society. But Mr. Trudeau does not seem to support that notion. He continues to apply pressure to the former Attorney General, either via himself or top members of his staff. And eventually, Ms. Raybould resigns because she is tired of having to keep telling these people that she does not want to do it. And funny enough, she had this pretty boss quote. Let me read this to you. So apparently she told this to Mr. Trudeau. "Are you politically interfering with my role? My decision as the Attorney General? I would strongly advise against it." Now, how boss is that? To tell that to the Prime Minister of Canada. Like, I wish it never had to happen like this, but I'm glad she stood her ground, because what's really happening here is SNC seems to have Mr. Trudeau in their pockets. He himself, the Prime Minister of Canada, get that, is vouching for SNC, a global firm. And what he's doing is going to his own Attorney General and telling her not to go forward with prosecutions against this company. Instead, he wants her to just settle with them outside of court. And just keep in mind how minor a thing settlements are for companies like this. $1 million, $10 million, $20 million. It's nothing to SNC. Them paying a fine and admitting to some wrongdoing is nothing to them. And let's get down to the crux of the issue. Justin Trudeau does not want SNC to go to federal court because it's highly likely they are found guilty. Otherwise, he wouldn't be putting in all this effort trying to convince Jody to not prosecute them. And let's look at the ramifications of that. If SNC goes to court and they are found guilty, they will be barred from bidding on federal contracts within Canada. And this is where Trudeau may or may not have a point. He says he's trying to avoid this outcome because he wants to save jobs. He doesn't want those Quebecois people to lose the 3,000 jobs they have right now and the other jobs scattered across Ontario. But this is an attempt by Trudeau to try and justify the ends via the means. But the means are not good. He was literally coercing a top-ranking Canadian official, the Attorney General, and trying to force her hand in a legal suit against a company that's been sought and caught to bribe officials internationally. And I would go as far as saying as this issue is actually non-partisan, because if you look at the parties, it seems they are unanimously against him. Even within his own Liberal caucus, people have started stepping down, like Miss Jane Philpott. She has resigned from his ministry. Conservatives are against him. The NDP is against him. It seems like he has no support for this whatsoever. So obviously, Mr. Trudeau denies all allegations of wrongdoing, and he scheduled a press conference 2 weeks ago to address the issue to the public, because there's been a lot of back and forth lately. Miss Jody took the stand to testify against Trudeau and the wrongdoings happening with the situation. Trudeau never really had an opportunity to give his side of the situation yet. He's given quotes here and there, but everything was really vague. So this was set up to be the time Trudeau would come on stage in front of all of Canada and enlighten us, explain to us exactly what happened. But guess what? That is not what happened. Honestly, this was probably one of the most ridiculous press conferences I've ever seen regarding a situation so grave. It seemed like Trudeau wasn't taking this seriously. It was a lot of blanket statements, quotes here and there that were somewhat irrelevant to the situation, and worst of all, there wasn't even an apology. It was a lot of rambling going on and on. You guys really need to hear this, so I picked out a quote, or not a quote, but a section that I feel like really summarizes what he was getting at.
Was not of a partisan nature.
It is our job as parliamentarians to defend the interests of the communities we were elected to represent, to be the voice of those communities in Ottawa. I stressed the importance of protecting Canadian jobs and reiterated that this issue was one of significant national importance. Ms. Wilson-Raybould left that meeting saying that she would speak with her deputy minister and the clerk about this matter, but that the decision was hers alone. In the months that followed that meeting, I asked my staff to follow up regarding Ms. Wilson-Raybould's final decision. I realize now that, in addition, I should have done so personally, given the importance of this issue and the jobs that were on the line. In recent days, I have reviewed the testimony from the Justice Committee, including that given by Ms. Wilson-Raybould, Gerald Butts, the Clerk of the Privy Council, and the Deputy Minister of Justice and Deputy Attorney General, recalling various interactions. Each of these interactions was a conversation among colleagues about how to tackle a challenging issue. Each came at a time when my staff and I believed that the former Minister of Justice and Attorney General was open to considering other aspects of the public interest. However, I now understand that she saw it differently. What has become clear through the various testimonies is that over the past months, there was an erosion of trust between my office, and specifically my former Principal Secretary, and the former Minister of Justice and Attorney General. It's about the push and pull of robust discourse and honest debate. It's about transparency and accountability. One of the things central to my leadership is fostering an environment where my ministers, caucus, and staff feel comfortable coming to me when they have concerns. Indeed, I expect them to do so. In Ms. Wilson-Raybould's case, she did not come to me, and I wish she had.
Honestly, that was such a load of crap. Let's break it down. Starting with that last piece. I wish he had come to me. Mr. Trudeau, how oblivious do you have to be of social cues to even make a statement like that? Let's say you have a boss who is consistently pestering you to do something and you don't want to do it. And he keeps nagging and nagging and even sends people to nag on his behalf. Are you going to approach him and try to talk him out of it? Especially given the context of the situation where you are the Prime Minister of Canada. You have absolute power over these people. It wasn't much of a discussion based on the way it seems to have played out to me. And it's just crazy to me that he's trying to make this response where he wishes that she came to him. Based on her allegation, she told you to leave her alone and let her make a decision, and you still continue to pester her. So completely bullshit comment that has no place in Parliament. And this brings me to my next favorite quote of the speech. Mr. Trudeau was apparently unaware that all this was happening. So let's say that's true, that he was unaware that this was happening. That's a major character flaw for a Prime Minister of Canada to have, to be completely unaware that the Attorney General is so displeased with your actions that she resigns publicly, and the only time you're made aware of this is when she makes the announcement in the paper. How could you be so oblivious to all the things that are happening in your caucus and not know that's happening? He's trying to make it sound like he was blindsided, and I just refuse to believe that. That doesn't make any sense to me, unless he is completely oblivious to the actions of his staff and what kind of impacts the things he does has on them. Then he continues to ramble on a little bit about leadership, his style of listening, learning and compassion, transparency and accountability, none of which he actually displayed in this press conference, especially the transparency and accountability aspect of that. He took zero accountability for anything that happened. He refused to admit wrongdoing, issued no apology, and it kind of seemed like he was trying to push the blame a little bit onto members of staff. Like it was their fault they resigned because they should have came to him. Completely crazy. And talking about transparency, he never really got to the nitty gritty. A bunch of Canadians were left wondering, like, why, Mr. Trudeau? Why were you so adamant about keeping SNC out of the courts? And he does a Bush League job of explaining this. He keeps deferring back to his main central argument, which is jobs. It's not like these 3,000 jobs would be completely evaporated if SNC was not allowed to bid on federal contracts. This is an open economy. SNC is a major engineering firm. Their downfall would signal to the market that there is room for other companies to expand. Other firms would grow, hire more people, take on more contracts, and there'd be more competitiveness in these firms. It's not as if SNC has a monopoly. Well, maybe that's what he wants. Maybe Trudeau wants a monopoly for SNC where they get all the contracts, but his primary defense is already not factual. And on top of that, it's not even justification because, as I've said prior, the means do not justify the ends. You cannot defend a company who commits illicit and illegal activities just because they bring jobs to Canada. What if it wasn't bribery? What if it was something much worse? Would Trudeau still be defending them on the basis of jobs? It's a completely mad claim to be making. He's making arguments about trying to, I guess you could say, trying to appease the Quebecois people because that's where he was originally from, and they're a major basis of support for him, and that's where a lot of these jobs are hosted. But Trudeau, you are the Prime Minister of Canada, not just Quebec, and this issue is far more than just a national one. It's international. Other countries are looking at you as if you have a bias to a certain company. If you want to talk about jobs, money, and investments, other global competitors are looking at Canada right now, seeing that Trudeau has a bias towards SNC, and they don't want to do business here because what if he has other dealings with other companies too, and they won't be allowed to compete fairly? Overall, completely crazy comments to make and unjustified. And even funnier than that, I didn't put this clip in the podcast because it was just too audacious, honestly. He starts talking about cannabis, going on a rant about how well the government's performing, and he's patting himself on the back, saying, oh, cannabis was introduced under my regime. It's like, look, Trudeau, yeah, cannabis may or may not have been a good move, but you shouldn't be trying to deflect attention away from the issue at hand. This press conference is about SNC, and you need to address that instead of trying to divert attention away. And no one's really buying that. They know it's painfully obvious what's going on here, honestly. And one last quote before we move on. Trudeau says, our government is stronger from having dealt with this issue. Like what? How could you make that comment? Some of your senior officials have resigned. Jane Philpott's gone. The Attorney General resigned. Your government's in chaos right now. You are not stronger. You're literally falling apart at the seams. It's crazy to me how he can put this mask on and lie to the Canadian populace. And the funniest part is that no one even buys it. If you look at the YouTube interview, the like to dislike ratio is off the charts. Everyone detected the BS and he got called out for it hard. So going forward, it's pretty interesting to ponder upon what the potential outcomes will be. First, legally, I don't think Trudeau is going to get impeached, and I don't think he's going to step down. You have other federal leaders like Andrew Scheer who want him to step down, and even the NDP leaders calling for a public investigation into the issue. Look, Trudeau is not going anywhere. It's clear that he doesn't see any wrongdoing with what happened here. There's no accountability to be had. And obviously he's going to be equipped with the best legal team, and they can frame his position in a variety of ways because the approach he took was actually pretty smart. He didn't directly tell her that she had to sell out of court. It was more implied, and with implied things comes a lot of interpretation. So the arguing that a good lawyer can do with that in the court system is astronomically large. So it's kind of like your friend who's like, hey, you should do this. And if you don't, well, this might happen to you. I'm not saying it will, it may or may not, but I heavily suggest you should take my advice and do this. So it was extremely implied, and given his position as the Prime Minister of Canada, it's a tough position to be in for Jody. I think she performed extremely well because the PM is asking you to do something. It's almost like a favor, and with the amount of power he holds on you, for her to resign and actually come public with what's happening was extremely commendable. So yeah, like, I don't see him being impeached. He's going to remain the Prime Minister of Canada for the time being. But here's the interesting thing. 2019, there's going to be a federal election, and I don't think Trudeau gets a second term, especially after something like this. And that's not even taking into account the other questionable decisions he's made as the Prime Minister of Canada. His reputation is just too far damaged. I don't see the Liberals getting too many votes. It might be a repeat of the Ontario election where they struggle to even maintain official party status. And I think it's going to come down to the Conservatives versus the NDP. But given the NDP's strong socialist ties, I can't even see them getting a lot of Canadian votes either. I think it's almost a certainty that the next Prime Minister is going to be Andrew Scheer. It's really their race to lose. Like, the Liberals are completely out of the picture, I believe. The Conservatives, if they have another big scandal come up too, then they could be out of the picture, and by default, it would be the NDP. Or what's that new party with Maxime Bernier? That'd be interesting to see how they do too, but that's only if these guys mess up too. So maybe that's a little bit of a consolation that his days are limited, but after such a scandal, there's almost no way he gets another term. So that was a pretty meaty segment. So let's move on onto the Boeing 737 MAX. Probably the most hated aircraft in all of the world right now, I'd say. So if you guys are unaware, recently a very tragic event happened with the Boeing 737 MAX. It was the aircraft used by Ethiopian Airlines when that massive crash happened and all the passengers on board died. The crazy thing was there was another airline, Lion Air, who did have a similar crash using the exact same aircraft, the 737 MAX. And because of this, people were wondering, why is this airplane crashing so often? And as a result, governments and companies around the world were forced to ground these planes. And that came with a whole bunch of drama because, first of all, you have a Boeing, massive manufacturing company. It's really only them and Airbus who compete on the large scale. And Boeing didn't want to admit wrongdoing because they wanted to preserve their brand image. So obviously they're saying things like, it may have been the pilot. We don't really know for sure. Let's take this investigation slow. And you also have the airline companies themselves because these planes are a major portion of their fleets. And if they're out of commission, they have to find ways to reroute people because a lot of people made plans for vacations in advance. And these planes were scheduled to deliver a certain amount of people. But now that they're grounded, these companies will have to do things like take on loans of other planes, maybe buy new planes quickly, get Airbus to come in and deliver something. A lot of semantics and issues that will arise if these planes are grounded. So there was a lot of pressure being applied to governments around the world to not ground them and wait for an investigation to happen. So at least they have time to plan. But I actually agree with the stance that the international governments took, which was to ground the planes immediately. It comes down to really, you don't know what the cause of the accident is. And that's actually more of an argument to ground them than not to ground them, because you can't be risking people's lives if you don't even know if it's the plane or the pilot. Imagine if you were the one country who didn't ground these planes and a third accident occurred. You would destroy your country's reputation, and even as a leader, your reputation would be tarnished as well. It's just too much of a risk. You can't have people dying because of negligence and giving into corporate pressures and stuff like that. The United States and Canada were a little bit slow to adopt the grounding policy, but eventually they did. I think that was a great move, and it may have been the best move to make because now there's a new report that comes out that possibly the failure was caused by these automatic stablers malfunctioning in both the aircraft, so the Ethiopian Airlines one and the Lion Air. And one thing that people have to understand about the argument that it may have been the pilot's fault, nowadays the pilots have very little interaction with actually flying the planes. So for the most part, they serve two purposes. One is to give you a peace of mind that there is a human in the cockpit. The second is an actual function if the autopilot or the plane malfunctions and they have to take over and manually land it or something like that. But for the most part, it's actually an autopilot that takes care of the plane. So making the argument that it may not be the plane doesn't really make sense to me because 99.9% of the time when a plane goes down, it's because of some type of issue with the plane itself. Unless the pilot willingly goes into manual and tries to crash it or something like that, where they fail a landing. And even then, to be in a position where you're failing a landing, something must have went wrong. And there's always the possibility that it was weather or turbulence, but the plane should be made to withstand these things. So overall, very tragic. I'm glad the planes are grounded. And if you look at Boeing, they're in a peculiar situation now because their brand image has been tarnished. Like, it's almost a guarantee. The 737 MAX, nobody's going to be riding in those planes. Like, those planes are grounded temporarily, but it might as well be a permanent grounding. There's not a lot of people who will be willing to get on these planes anymore. So this entire line of planes might have to be discontinued by Boeing. They're going to have to create a new model or completely scrap the idea and go back to their old models and sell those. And at the same time, you have Airbus, a major competitor who has identical capacities as Boeing, who can just scoop in. And you've already seen Boeing has lost contract after contract from these airlines going to Airbus now because Airbus is swooping in saying our planes don't have problems like this. Our planes are great. Why are you with Boeing? So Boeing is in a really crappy situation right now and their stock has plummeted. If you're a believer that they can make a turnaround, then maybe you buy now while it's low. And if you are a current Boeing shareholder, I feel bad for you. I really do. I think that's enough of depressing news for today. Let's move on to a more interesting, or not interesting, everything I talked about was pretty interesting, I would say, for today, but a more lighthearted segment. I call this casual conversations, and it might not be a part of every episode. I might mix it in with like audience questions, mailbag, stuff like that, but casual conversations I want to have it where I talk about almost, you could say, random topics, like giving my opinion about certain things, talking about recommendations, or even like life stories, life lessons, things like that. So for today, I want to talk about a book I'm reading. It's called Brave New World. It was written in the 1900s, but oddly enough, it may have done an amazing job at predicting how our future might be. So the context of the book is pretty much they've taken human breeding and developed it down to a mechanized machine-like process. So people don't reproduce via sex anymore. In this dystopian universe, there is a factory in pretty much every country now where people are just DNA surgically edited to come out a certain way. So the first thing that happens in the factory is they have like an artificial ovary that gets impregnated with a certain type of sperm cell. And based on the composition of this now combined cell, you get a ranking. It's either you are an alpha, a beta, a gamma, a delta, or I think it's like epsilon. It's like a Greek term. It's one step below delta. And based on this, it predetermines where you will rank in the social hierarchy of the world. So the alphas are dominant. They are extremely smart. They are genetically engineered to be taller, stronger, more articulate, and they get better jobs too because even in this factory, from the time you are a cell, they genetically modify you to perform a function in society. So the alphas are the professors, the engineers, the politicians, people like that. And the deltas and the lower tier people, they're actually mass produced. And they've taken twinning and broken it down into a crazy process where they can produce 128 of the same identical person with the same function. So that's like 128 people to stock shelves for you. They're mass producing like low labor people to farm and stuff like that. And there's no breaking out of where you are socially. From the time you develop as a cell, you get your ranking, and that's where you're going to be. It's how you're going to grow up to become. And the next step of the process is actually when you're born. When you're born, they put in these headphones into you every night when you sleep. And it socially, I guess, climatizes you to certain preconceptions of the world. So for example, the alphas will be like, I'm so glad I'm an alpha, I'm dominant, I'm the king of the world, I'm so happy, stuff like that. The betas will be like, I'm glad I'm a beta, you know, it could be better, I could have been an alpha, but thank goodness I'm not a gamma or a delta. That would be terrible. And the gammas and deltas are just programmed to find happiness in like subtle things. Like some of them find happiness in just seeing sunlight and like things that are trivial like that, so they don't go crazy in their current role. And after that happens, there's another step. It's actually torture. So only the alphas are really allowed to become educated and read and stuff like that. The other babies, they're given this exercise where there's toys and books laid out in front of them, and they're free to go get something. So if the baby touches the book, they have like a shock collar and they get shocked, and it's not like a little like mini elastic shock or something you get when you touch the floor or something. It's a real electrical surge that tortures these babies. So as they grow up, they develop a preconception where they think books are evil, books are harmful, and on top of that, they don't even know how to read. So they don't even have the tools to read, and now they see books as evil, so they can never learn. And that's pretty much the framework of the book. So here comes the main character, and he's an alpha, but there was an issue when they were creating him. He didn't get the proper hormones, the genes to make him tall. So all the alphas are really tall. They're really muscular, tall, and good looking, stuff like that. He came out kind of ugly and short, but he's still an alpha. And this realization kind of shocked him and made him understand a concept that was long forgotten: individuality. Other alphas were now recognizing him as an alpha, and even the betas and the gammas and the deltas were confused. Sometimes they wouldn't obey him because they didn't even know he was an alpha due to his height. He wasn't easily identifiable. So he started realizing things like, oh, maybe I'm not an alpha. I'm labeled as one, but I am me. I am different. And this thought process kind of triggered something in him. You could say it awoke a primal instinct, the need to be yourself. And funny enough, there's another person who he meets, a friend. He's also an alpha, but he is a super genius. So alphas are already made to be smart. This guy is leagues above the rest. He is a genius. And it's funny, you could consider both these people to be defects, factory errors. One of them was on the low end, he's short, but the other one's on the extremely high end. He actually broke the barrier. He is smarter than all the alphas, and he's also realizing that he is an alpha, but at the same time he's really not, because he's kind of different. He's smarter than the rest, and now they're working together, and it's crazy. There's a small civilization of people who escaped the empire, and they're living amongst themselves with traditional human means, kind of like us. Like, they're still reproducing the way that we would naturally, and they're in constant fear, hiding from the empire, because the empire doesn't want these people to exist. There's already a protocol, and they don't want anything happening to the status quo. So these two alphas are probably going to go on a mission now to meet these people and I guess learn about human history, because they've also replaced all the history and replaced the god figure and all that stuff in the book. I haven't read all of it yet, but the way it's going so far, I'm like, wow, I can really see this happening, honestly. Like, if you look at places like China, where they're already experimenting with DNA surgery, creating babies who come out a certain type of way, I'm just like, wow, how far off is a reality like this? And it's pretty crazy. So I'm going to read more of the book. I'll get back to you guys on what happens. I already have a bad feeling it's going to be a tragic one, because I kind of get the George Orwell dystopian type of vibe from it. But I feel like it's a good book. I highly recommend it to a lot of people, because I feel like it can appeal to a wide array of audiences. There's some action, there's some intellectual aspects to the book. I think there's even some romance, so definitely could go for anyone. And with that, I think that sums up the first episode of the Perri Platform. Thanks for joining me. I'll see you soon.